Julie and I are here with our dad, Robert Monroe, at the time of his retirement on May 3rd, 2009, and we're asking him questions about his youth and growing up, significant moments.
Well, this is a terrible time to ask about significant moments. They should have been asked 40 years ago when I could remember what was significant. But we started this interview process some time ago, and we covered some of my early childhood. So I'll recall some things from junior high into and through high school. And of course, all of my childhood was spent, or if not spent, certainly occurred in the little town of Portis, Kansas, quite far away from most everything else. So what was important to us was very local, very focused, and really quite different from what my friends and relatives in other larger communities experienced. I recall in junior high, one of the more significant events in our community was the building of a new high school and grade school. And it was significant because it really changed so much our activities, both in the community and our activities in school. And it changed, I think, how a lot of us viewed our own selves and our own lives, because for the first time we had a gymnasium. And at the time we moved into that new school, I was 12 years old in the 7th grade. Prior to that, we went to school in an old two-story frame fire trap with 1907 written above the door. There was no gymnasium, only a basement, a first floor, and a second floor. And when I went there in the first grade, my dad was the superintendent, and I recall we always worried about fire, so he'd have a fire drill about every month. But I would always worry where my dad was, because he never got out of the building, and I was afraid if we ever really had a fire, he'd be in there someplace doing something. Well, as it turned out, the fire bell was right behind the front door, which was always open and back against the wall. He'd go down there and pull that door back against himself so he could see us all going out, but we couldn't see him. Anyway, that old building was discarded in 1950. We moved into this new building. For the first time, we had a gymnasium where we could play basketball and other games. The grade school students were in 4 rooms, 2 grades each, on one side of the gymnasium, a music room on one end, a stage on the other room, and 4 high school rooms on the other side of the gymnasium. And of course, that meant there were only 4 classes occurring at any 1 hour of the day. And since every student would take 4 classes and every student needed 16 to graduate, you can count pretty quickly how many electives we did not have. None. So everybody took a class every hour, and then we went to the gym. And we really went quite early in the name of phys ed, but what it was an extended basketball practice. And as a result of that new gymnasium, within a few years, we all became what we thought were quite accomplished athletes. And as a matter of fact, it was the best gymnasium in the region, so we always had all of our tournaments there. And pretty soon, as we got into high school, we found out we had a better team than most everyone else. And I think the reason was the gymnasium, the place to play, because before that, the Portis grade school and high school, including my early years, had to play basketball in an old livery stable that had a basketball floor built in the middle of it, a great big pot-bellied stove under the bleachers on one side that burned coal, and a big door in either end. It was cold, it was dirty, and it was 4 blocks from the school, so you can see there wasn't much place to practice. At any rate, athletics quickly moved to the top of our activity list. And as I look back, and one of my classmates at a reunion mentioned, he says, all I can remember about school was athletics and girls on the weekends. And this student was really, this friend was really a good student. But that was it. Athletics was the dominant interest, the dominant activity, 9 months of the year. Girls were the primary interest on weekends, and we all worked on the farms in the summer. Mm-hmm. And I guess I can say in that community there were just about 3 really significant focal points of social activity and personal priority. It was family, it was church, it was school. And in school, it was athletics and other fun things. It was a pretty simple life. And it was simple in terms of relationships, because not only had we all known each other since first grade, 6 of us that started first grade together were in the high school graduating class 12 years later. And the other 3 had joined us in 3rd grade. So there wasn't a lot of attrition, there wasn't a lot of addition. And there certainly weren't any dropouts. Even for those who weren't smart enough to get a degree, everybody graduated. So dropout rate was 0. Success rate was 100%. And school was really fun. It was a fun place to be. And the main thing I remember about those times was that there were no worries. Now, you'd think we had pretty much everything we wanted because we didn't have to worry about anything. And we didn't really want anything we didn't have that I can recall. But the problem with that was we didn't know what there was to want. And it never occurred to us, without television, without extensive access to publications, we didn't observe all the things in the world that other people had. So our focus was on family, time spent with each other, time spent with friends, and time involved in simple things in that community. And through high school, it seemed that every day was pretty much the same, and that we all looked forward to what appeared to be a really long time off, and that was graduation. But we didn't really look forward to it in the sense of leaving. It was just the next thing that was going to happen. And I don't recall that very many students, any of us, had any serious, explicit discussion, plannings about what we were going to go and what we were going to do. Some of them knew they weren't going to college. Some of them knew they weren't going to leave the town or the county. Others of us knew we were, and there wasn't any reason to discuss it or think about it. That's just the way it was going to be. And it was kind of as simple as most every other issue and event in the community. But one of the most unique and supportive parts of that community was that I think every young person in the community felt like they had multiple parents, both in a positive and in a somewhat of an oppressive way. You couldn't go any place, you couldn't do anything, you couldn't be anywhere that somebody wasn't able to observe who you are, what you were doing, and have a pretty strong feeling about where you should be and what you should be doing. And there was a lot of admonition across generation and across families. But the other part of that was, I don't think any of us ever had a question as what we would do if we didn't have any parents, or if something happened to our parents, because everybody else seemed as supportive as our own families, and everybody helped everybody else. If somebody got sick, all of the farmers would get together, pretty much like a social event, bring their tractors, their equipment, they'd plow the guy's field or harvest the guy's wheat, and it would all get done just kind of like a big celebration. But the thing I always remember most about that aspect of the community was not only were these people supportive as sort of a duty or responsibility, they were genuinely interested. Now maybe it's because there wasn't anything else in that little town to be interested in, but they really were. The old guys, about the age I am now and on up, would sit on a bench in front of the doctor's office and in front of the post office. And yes, we had a doctor's office, we had a post office, we had 3 drugstores, 3 grocery stores, a drugstore, a barber shop, a restaurant and beer parlor, a beauty parlor, a weekly newspaper, a lumber yard, 3 service stations, an elevator, a grain elevator, a creamery, a place where we all took our eggs and cream and sold them, and almost were able to afford to buy enough feed to feed the chickens for the next week. But these old guys would sit out there in front of the doctor's office and the post office. And they had what seems to me now to be some really funny names. There was Scott Cowan, there was Herndon Garber, there was Rawls Garver, there was Hap Damon, Slick Fleener. The list went on and on. Scott Cowan. None of those names seemed unusual to me then, but they were, and they were just about as unusual as the old gentlemen themselves. John Dillon is one of them. And he happened to be my girlfriend's grandfather, so he took special interest in what I did every day. We couldn't walk in to get our mail, and everybody had to go to the post office to get the mail because there was no rural delivery. Every day we'd walk in. One of them would say, "Hey, Bob, what'd you think of that game last night? You did really pretty well. You should have won that game, though." There was always a comment about what we should have done, could have done. And they were all very friendly. But they were also very genuinely interested. And Ed Winters was the town marshal. Ed would sit there on that bench with an old car parked nearby, and if somebody came speeding through, he'd get in it, drive down, and have a long talk to them. But mainly it was just kids. He wouldn't take on anybody really moving through in a fast car, but if one of the kids would run a stop sign or go a little too fast, he'd go have a talk. He always wore this big wool coat. I never understood. Until years later, his grandson, a friend of mine, told me why. He says, "Well, didn't you know? Grandpa was town marshal, and he carried this big .45 revolver under this coat, and he kept it covered up with a coat. Summer and winter, Ed Winters had the coat on. And he also had his marshal badge, but he was also the town bootlegger. That was in the days when liquor by the drink was illegal. Liquor in any form was illegal in Kansas. He had a big wine cellar up in the part of town. People would come in and ask for Ed Winters, and he'd tell them that's who he was. And it wasn't hard to find anybody in town. Everybody knew where everybody was most of the time. So he would take them up to the wine cellar and get them their wine or their liquor, and then he would start to give them their change and pull that big wool coat back. grandson said a lot of those people buying liquor just almost passed out when they'd see his badge and his gun. But he'd just give them the change and go on back down and wait for the next customer. We had a pretty small number of activities as we did small curriculum in that school, but we always had a junior and senior play. And of course, everybody had to be in it, because if you've only got 9 people in your class, it'd be a terrible thing to leave one of them out. So it was kind of difficult for the teachers to find a play that had only 9 people in it, no more and no less. But somehow or other, they always seemed to find one. We'd have one the junior year, one the senior year. Then we always had a junior and a senior banquet. Now, as banquets go, it would be pretty hard to recognize. It'd be pretty hard for young people in this day and age to recognize what we had as a junior and senior banquet. First of all, it was right there in the middle of that gym floor, because that's where everything else happened, including commencements, including baccalaureates, including assemblies, including basketball games, volleyball games, and the junior and senior banquet. And it was quite a challenge to decorate a gym floor for a banquet, and particularly since these banquets were what we all know now as proms. There was no prom. I don't ever recall that anybody ever took a date to one of these things. We just went. And there was a nice meal, and the juniors always had to serve the seniors. The sophomores had to serve the juniors. And somebody had to decorate. From the flat gym floor up, we had to figure out how we were going to decorate this place. It always ended up just being a bunch of paper mache streamers hung on wires hung from the ceiling, and a bunch of tables with paper mache tablecloths. But as you can tell, it wasn't a really sophisticated environment or set of activities. And that's what made a transition from that high school to college a lot more scary than it was difficult. Because anything outside that city, that little town, seemed to us be really big time, including the county seat with 1,800 people in it that was 8 miles away. That was a pretty uptown event. And about the farthest we ever got was some of us, because our parents would take us, had a chance to go to a place like Kansas City. That was about the extent of the distance travels. So when it came time for the senior trip, and there was always a senior trip, I don't think anybody could spell Caribbean, much less know where Cancun, Cozumel, Jamaica, or any of those places were. And it was just beyond even the potential of our imagination to think that anybody might go there, much less a bunch of students. So our frame of reference in terms of trips was either to go to the mountains and see the scenery, or to go to Kansas City and have a good time. And most senior classes went to Kansas City, as did mine. And as I recall, about all we did was eat, go to movies, because of course there wasn't a movie theater in Portis, Kansas. Went to the movies, and then we went to the places that all serious young people should see, of course, like the Federal Reserve Bank and the FBI and the gruesome inventory of body parts that were kept in the basement of the FBI building as what was going to happen to people if they drank alcohol or smoked cigarettes or did things like that. I don't ever recall the word drug being used, and I don't think it was in a vocabulary except on the front of a store that sold prescription drugs. So of course there was no crime, except for the fact that sometimes in the middle of the night a few people would go out and steal gasoline out of other farmers' gas tanks if they left the equipment sitting out in the middle of the fields. The ironic part of that was gasoline was 25 cents a gallon. And whenever I would go out with my parents' car in the evenings, I'd be expected to come back with at least as much gas as I started out. I don't ever recall putting more than $1 worth in. So knowing the stations would be closed always at 7 or 8 o'clock, we'd always stop and get $1 worth regular before we started out for the evening. And at about 20 miles to the gallon, for $1, you could go 80 miles. And the two towns where we usually went were only about 10, 12 miles, 20 miles away. So $1 worth of gas for the evening, 50 cents for a movie ticket at most. Cokes were never more than a dime, and hamburgers a quarter, even if you had to buy one for your date. It usually didn't run over a couple of dollars, which doesn't sound like much, but anybody working by the hour then would have to work for at least 4 hours to gather together $2 worth at 50 cents an hour. So it was a significant sacrifice to take somebody out for a $2 evening. It's funny as I look back on that, as I've gone back to a few alumni celebrations, the people haven't changed. The nature of the people haven't changed. But none of those people who were so supportive are there. Their children are, their descendants are, and the behavior's the same. The kids who were once the object of all of their attention are now the same hovering group of parents sharing and caring about their kids and other people's kids. Pretty simple environment. And in 1956, when I graduated from high school, college was a totally undefined experience that I knew I was going to have. And that was about the extent of my preparation. Because my dad had gone to college and talked about his college work and his majors, I was one of the few that really knew what a major was and how a major might differentiate from a degree and how either one might have anything to do with what you might do the rest of your life. So there wasn't a lot of planning for college. I do remember when I made my first trip to the state campus in the summer after my high school graduation to inquire about admission. Of course, there was nothing online because there was no line. So you had to physically go get any document you wanted and fill it out with pen and pencil. I thought I'd stop in and pick up application forms and a catalog. It was about a 2 hours drive. I got there in the middle of the day and drove around campus for quite a while. Never did figure out how to get from one place to another, nor did I ever figure out where it was that I might be able to pick up applications. And I finally got so overwhelmed and confused, I just drove home. Never got out of the car. And as I look back on that, there was a whole day, a 4-hour drive, and I still didn't have my application. But I think we finally solved that problem by writing a letter and asked for a college application. And as I recall, several weeks later, something finally came in the mail. So our orientation, socially, culturally, and certainly politically, was quite superfluous. Our education about fundamentals was substantial. The fundamental tools, I thought we had received a really very solid education. But discussions of politics did not occur in that community. Everybody practiced religion and held dearly to their religious beliefs with almost a vengeance, and at least an enthusiasm that sometimes exceeded social protocol. But never was there an argument about religion. Never was there an argument about politics that I can recall. And in fact, I recall if anybody in our family would have anything negative to say about the leaders of the country, and certainly the president, it was not acceptable to be critical or speak poorly of high elected officials. And as a result of all of that, we didn't have a very good insight about what our parents felt and believed about politics, and we sure didn't know what we thought ourselves. Those values were formulated years later. We, even at meals, as I recall, conversations did not revolve around politics or economics or religion. And in this day and age, I think one would have to wonder what there was to talk about if it weren't politics and religion and economics. Well, I haven't said much about my friends, so let me comment a little bit. My best two friends were born about the same month. And of course, we'd known each other since we could remember because our mothers had known each other since they were born. And in fact, our grandmothers, in many cases, were close childhood or young adult friends who had settled in that community in the early part of the 1900s. So it was not uncommon for everybody to know how and where everyone was born, which in our case was in the Birch Hospital, which is one more unusual thing about that little community. We had a hospital. There was no hospital in the county. There was no hospital in the county to the north of us, nor to the west of us. But there was a hospital in Portis, Kansas, and we had a doctor and a doctor's office. Of course, he was also the biggest farmer in the county, and he spent most of his time out farming. But this old doctor with a peg leg had delivered almost everybody in that community. And so as soon as we were old enough to play together, on very unusual and special occasions, our mothers would let us get together and have an afternoon or a day, and sometimes even an overnight to play. So we'd known these friends from early childhood. And I remember one of my classmates, Gary Watts. I remember the first time I met him, his grandfather was helping, who was my grandfather's best friend. He was helping my dad build fence. So he went with his grandfather, I went with my dad. We were about 4 years old. We played in the dirt all day long. My other friend, Norman Gensler, all of us were within a month of each other. I had known him since 3 or 4 years old. And several of the other children in the class, our parents were friends, or we went to the same church. So going to school was just like going from one family to another. Everybody knew each other. Everybody had known each other a long time. And we knew everybody's parents talked to everybody else's parents, so there wasn't a whole lot you could do or say that didn't get communicated quite quickly. But most of all, I look back on those years as the most carefree years, the most worry-free years, and probably the happiest and most positive childhood experiences that one could have, because there was a virtual absence of threat and there was a virtual absence of dissatisfaction, not only individually but collectively. And I think it was an environment that our parents created for us that none of us have ever been able to create for our own children. We'll take a break.